We have a very special guest tonight, Kathy Kelly. I'm sure many of you have seen her in person and on Democracy Now!
Well, I grew up in a part of the southwest side of Chicago that was so ghettoized, it's almost indescribable. And we were trying very, very hard always to fit in. My mother had a thick Irish brogue, and we didn't even realize that because there was so much of an effort to be like everybody else, kind of cross over one shoulder and flag over the other. And I remember so clearly when my mother's brother, Uncle Dick, was coming over from Ireland, I was very excited because this was something different, and we'd meet our mother's brother. And Uncle Dick walked in the door. I was a teenager, so eager to see him. He took one look at me and he said, "Oh, lass, you've got the map of Ireland written on your face." And I was upstairs crying for 2 hours, thinking all he noticed was my acne, because I'd never heard this map of Ireland on your face business. We didn't know how to do the dancing, the songs, any of it. We were just white and Catholic and all went to the same school. So that's the kind of a background from which I came. But it's on my mind a bit because I'd like to begin tonight by telling you quite a lot about me finally going to Ireland. It wasn't something that ever occurred to me to do, really, but I was almost Johnny One Note along with Bert. I think he and I might have been in the Voices in the Wilderness network from 1996 onward, two who had traveled most often back and forth to Baghdad, all in the name of breaking the economic sanctions. We'd pack our bags with medicines and medical relief supplies and sheet music and other such things and peel off to go to Baghdad. Well, as it seemed that warfare was more and more imminent, in January of 2003, I had been invited to go over to Ireland by the Sisters of St. Bridget in Kildare, Ireland, because Ireland was feeling particularly complicit in many quarters of the peace movement with the United States war effort, because United States warplanes were doing pit stops. They were landing in Shannon Airport on the tarmac, and many of these planes were bringing soldiers and other military over to Kuwait and to Saudi Arabia and other bases, but they were also bringing weapons and ammunition. And Ireland is a neutral country, and by constitution, they were not to give any support to a belligerent country or to a country provoking warfare. So ought it not be off limits for these planes to make a pit stop? So the Sisters of St. Bridget also wanted people to understand more empathetically what it would be like for people in Iraq, in the crosshairs of the world's largest arsenal, getting ready to go to war. And I had been in Iraq with our, what we declared the Iraq Peace Team. And so I was going to come out just one more time to go and help one last group get ready to come over and join us. And it worked out that I could stop off in Ireland. So I made my first trip to Ireland that January, and I did my best to give a talk that would help people understand that, yes, indeed, people in Iraq were terrified. That I knew women who had actually gone to Dominican sisters and asked them, please, we want cesarean section for delivery of their babies, because they were so frightened to give birth to their babies under bombardment. I talked about men whom Bert and I know, who I regarded as men with nerves of steel, who would look at me and just blurt out, "Kathy, I am so scared." People had the memories of the 1991 bombing, the 1998 bombing. I myself had been there during 1998, and I remembered a young woman named Entisar who had just run to her door. People didn't have any advance notice. She'd heard a big explosion. She looked out, a big chunk of shrapnel hit her, and it had ruptured her spleen, and she was in the hospital when I met her, and the surgery had been successful. Her spleen had been removed. You could live without a spleen. But she needed a colostomy bag temporarily, and under economic sanctions, this hospital had only one colostomy bag to share amongst 5 patients. And so Entisar was very, very frightened. Well, these were the kinds of stories I knew of, along with pictures of mother after mother after mother who would murmur to us, "Believe me, we hope it will never happen to a mother in your country." I remember a British nurse sitting next to me looking at a ward of dying children saying, "I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it?" And so war had never really ended for people in Iraq. The Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War, the economic sanctions war, 500,000 children under age 5 died. And the United Nations told us it was a direct result of the economic sanctions. It was a silent warfare. And I wanted to bring attention to that. So I gave my talk, and then I left, and I went to Iraq, and I learned about 5 days later that 5 people who had been at the talk, one of whom I knew quite well, the other 4 were acquaintances, had gone out to the tarmac at the Shannon airport and did $2.5 million worth of damage to a United States Navy warplane. Well, I didn't tell them to do it. So you can bet I then went over to Ireland with some regularity because I was always pulled in as a defense witness. And the trial was very elongated. It took 5 years. And the first time around, a judge had to recuse himself because he did have an Irish temper. He kind of blew, and so he was asked to get off the case. And then another judge had had dinner with George and Laura Bush on 3 occasions, so he was asked to get off the case. And so this was the 3rd time around. A woman judge, very dramatic inside the courtroom. The judges wear the sheepskin wig, and all of the barristers have the black frocks and the sheepskin wigs. And so I was paying very, very close attention. I was nervous that I might be an albatross around the necks of these 5 defendants because this judge was making it perfect clear that there will be no talk of a faith-based motive for what these defendants had done. She said it was a political act. And the defendants were saying that, in fact, they were totally motivated by something some of you may be familiar with. It comes from the Old Testament. When shall come the day, O Lord, Isaiah chapter 2, when they shall beat their swords into pruning hooks and their spears into plowshares. Nation shall not lift the sword against nation, neither shall they continue to learn the ways of war any longer. So these 5 called themselves the pit stop plowshares. They saw themselves as having done their level best to beat swords into plowshares. They said they were completely motivated by faith, and so it was a bit of a standoff between them and the judge. Well, at the end of all of the testimony, the barristers, as they call lawyers there, can make a final summation, and they can say whatever they want. Now, it happened that these 5 defendants had 3 of the best barristers in all of Ireland, very skillful men. And one of them, even the prosecutor referred to as the last of the great Irish orators. His name was Mr. Nix, and he looked like he was right out of Central Casting. He had a kind of a portly bearing and a daddy walrus mustache and grizzled gray hair that he kept back in a ponytail and beady eyes and the sheepskin wig. Well, he began his summation by declaring to the judge that the greatest pacifist of all time was Jesus Christ, and the greatest political document ever written was the Sermon on the Mount. And there he was reading the Sermon on the Mount to a Dublin working class jury, and the judge and all of us kind of dropped our jaws, and people's pens had stopped in midair. And then he declared that the problem with these 5 is they don't practice their religion a la carte. I'll take a little bit of this, but put a hold on that. They believe what their religion says, to love their enemies and not to kill them. Well, he carried on in this vein, and then he kind of changed tune, and Mr. Nix started to describe a beautiful day in a Dublin park. A day when he had watched children running up the hill chasing ducks, and then the ducks were chasing the children down the hill, and the children were screaming and squealing. And Mr. Nix assured all of us the most universal sound of beauty, and any language must be the sound of children at play. And then his voice thickened, his face darkened. Mr. Nix boomed at us, "They're bombing children in a swimming canal in Lebanon. Children are swimming in a pool of their own blood." I was so fixated on the trial, I honestly wasn't quite sure what he was talking about. I had a vague notion that there was a war going on with the Israeli-Hezbollah war it was referred to. I knew that it was a terrible agony for those over, but I was fixated on what was happening there. So I grabbed a quick go through a Guardian issue and read exactly the place that Mr. Nix was speaking of, a town called Chasmia. And there was a little swimming hole that the children went to with their parents to cool off. They'd jump in, parents would sip a Pepsi on the brink of this swimming hole, and a missile had directly hit the swimming hole. There were little tiny plastic sandals caked with blood and mud distributed around the swimming hole. And one of their fathers was staring into this swimming hole and holding his head in his hands and roaring in his grief, "Hezbollah here? Only children here. My son here." And Of the 11 children, 3 were missing, 7 critically injured. Well, Mr. Nix, in a sense, put all of us on trial. He said, the question is not, did these 5 have a lawful excuse to do what they did? The question is, what's our excuse not to do more? Would you not try, if you could, to stop a Hezbollah missile from slamming into northern Israel? Would you not try, if you could, to stop an Israeli bomb from slamming into a children's swimming canal? What will rise you? In a way, it was almost like an afterthought that the 5 were acquitted. The trial, in a sense, continues, I believe, with Mr. Nix's very compelling question, what will rise you? What will rise me? I wasn't surprised to find myself volunteering to go with a group of internationals asked to accompany some very brave Lebanese, I guess you could say Lebanese young urban professionals. They were people who were quite secure as things went in Beirut, even though electricity was scarce and the war had caused a great deal of damage already. They decided that after they'd seen so many refugees coming up from southern Lebanon, that even though they certainly by appearance were not part of Hezbollah, they were going to organize a convoy, fill up the trunks of their cars with needed medicines and food, and put a big number on each car, declare a press event, and then start making their convoys way south of the Litani River into southern Lebanon in an area where the Israelis had declared any moving vehicle is a military target. So they had 59 vehicles and some international accompaniment, but primarily these very sturdy, young, extremely well-organized people. Well, the convoy itself was stopped by the Lebanese military, but then after 4 more days, the bombing ended, a ceasefire was declared, and I had an opportunity to go with 2 young men, both named Mohammed, both 19 or 20 years of age, who had a vehicle that could manage these very, very bumpy and destroyed roads. And we went south of the Litani River. We went to numerous villages. We saw Khasmia, the place where the father had wept over his son. And we had in our pocket a list that Professor Norman Finkelstein had developed of 13 places where he believed massacres had taken place. And it was very awkward, really, to step outside of Muhammad's vehicle and ask somebody, could you please tell us where the massacre was, and then get directions. But we went to the village of Qana. I had perhaps always heard of it as the village of Qana in the New Testament. And there, well, actually, a young teenage boy looked at us very wryly. He said, which one, when we asked him where the massacre had been. Because this was a place where previously Palestinians seeking refuge, 106 people had been killed at a United Nations refugee camp in, I believe, 1996. I'm not certain of that year. So we went there and we were silent, and then we followed the directions, and we actually found ourselves walking right into a commemoration for a place where parents had sent their children into a basement of a sturdy building for overnight safer sleep, and then the children would come out and be with the parents and play with each other in the daytime. And Farah and I separated from the men that were with us, and we were pretty well without a translator at that point, but we joined the women who were in a patio in front of one house, and the men were in white plastic chairs in front of another. And we just sat in silence with the women, and because of others who came and embraced one particular woman, we began to realize she was one of the mothers who'd lost a daughter. And she was wearing a medical hood and a neck brace, and it was clear, her abaya over that movement at all was difficult for her. But then when she started talking to us, it was as though a torrent of words had to pour out. And she spoke a fair amount of English. And she, very painfully wincing, pointed upward. And she was pointing at drone surveillance airplanes that were still crisscrossing the skies over this town. And she said, didn't they see? Didn't they know? My daughter, my Zainab, she ran across the road. They have not this information. And then she asked her son to go and get a stack of newspapers. And I saw a photo that I'd actually seen taped on taxi cabs, even in Beirut. The funeral had been much delayed, but it was a photo of a helmeted relief worker holding up the lifeless body of her daughter, Zainab, and in his own grief, screaming. And then there was another photo that she showed to us of two beautiful 6-year-old children, Zahra and Zainab, cuddled up in each other's arms, and that's how the relief workers found them. They weren't mutilated at all. What killed both of those two little girls was the force of the explosion destroying their internal organs. And then she sent her son to go and get one more picture. And this was a picture of a 6-year-old child with round saucer eyes and tousled curly hair, and one of those very serious expressions where you can only imagine the wide smile. And she tapped the plastic over that picture, and she fixed me with a very definite look and the question, is she the terrorist? And then what sent that young mother into paroxysms of sobbing was the need to tell us just 2 more sentences. She loved to study her English words. My daughter, she loved to practice her English. And that a source of great pain to her now. Bert and I and others in your community who might have ever gone to Iraq before the United States occupation of Iraq would have been very hard-pressed to come back to your audiences here with stories that would answer a question, why do they hate us so much? Primarily, we were kind of wondering, why do they love us so much? This in Iraq after 13 years of economic sanctions. But I learned so much during those brief encounters in the town of Qana, where you could see that it would be asking too much to expect that people who might know that, in fact, in Edina, Minnesota, there's a factory that manufactures cluster bombs, and they were cheering on the factory floor because of the good deals that had been conducted in the spring of 2006. In the spring of 2006, that factory had the flag of Israel flying over the factory buildings because Israel was consuming their cluster bombs. In the last 4 days of the Israeli-Hezbollah war, 1.2 million cluster bombs were dropped just in the last 4 days. While Condoleezza Rice had said, don't stop now, keep the war going, don't sign an agreement. Altogether, 3.5 million cluster bombs. That's so good for business in the United States. The United States has had a direct relationship to so much of the violence and the suffering going on in Iraq. Now, I can tell you that I loved my mother very, very much. She died recently. But I hope that somehow my family and my mother would forgive me for delivering to you a quote that I think is very, very instructive. I'd come back from Baghdad, and I was sitting at my mother's side, and I wanted really to tell her a lot about what had happened. But my mother has a combination of Irish charm and mother wit and Fox News. And so it just wasn't going to happen that I was going to tell her what happened in Iraq. She was going to tell me what was happening in Iraq. And basically, this is what she had to say. She said, Kathy, what you don't understand is that the people of Iraq could have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein a long time ago. And they should have, and they didn't. And so we went over there and we did it for them. And they ought to be grateful, and they're not. Case closed. Now, it's interesting to me that if you were to ask members of my extended family, whose view do you think is the one that you would adopt? Mom's or Kathy's? They'd all say, oh, Mom. Because it's a lot more comfortable to believe that those Iraqis ought to be grateful, but they're not. And I'd just like to explore that idea with you a little bit further. In the year 2005 alone, Save the Children now reports that 122,000 Iraqis didn't reach their 5th birthday. Now, things didn't get better in 2006. We know they're not going at all well now in 2007. The World Health Organization reported on April 16th that in Iraq now, 80% of Iraqi families can't separate their toilet water from the water they use for other household purposes. 70% of Iraqis don't have access on a regular basis to potable water. 21% of Iraqi children are malnourished. Imagine the expectation that Iraqis ought to be grateful. I think we could all probably agree that if Iraq grew asparagus, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion at all. And I would like to read something, because I don't want you to think that this is my bad grammar, so I'm going to read this from your president. Asked, did he think that the United States was doing an acceptable job in Iraq? He deflected it entirely to the Iraqis. He said, well, I don't that we didn't do a better job or they didn't do a better job. I think I am proud of the efforts we did. We liberated that country from a tyrant. I think the Iraqi people owe the American people a huge debt of gratitude. That's the problem here in America. They wonder whether or not there is a gratitude level that's significant enough in Iraq. Gratitude. I don't want to sound like sour grapes, but voices in the wilderness, when we declared that we would go over to Iraq bringing medicines and medical relief supplies, within 7 days had a very stiff letter of warning from the United States Treasury Department. Keep this up and you'll risk a 12 years in prison, a $1 million fine, and a $250,000 administrative penalty. Well, I read in the May 2nd issue of the New York Times, buried in the business section, that the United States' second largest oil company, Chevron, is now settling up outside of court for having broken the economic sanctions against Iraq to the tune of $20 million worth of surcharges that they paid under the table to Saddam Hussein's government. Now, I don't mind saying I'm glad. I'm glad that all of those big oil companies paid surcharges and smuggled oil, because I don't know how anybody could run a country on what the oil for food deal was allowing. It was something like $1.25 per year per person. Bert, is that more than it was? 52 cents per day per person in all of Iraq. That's what the oil for food was allowing for maintenance of every aspect of the country. So it is interesting to me, though, that Condoleezza Rice was on the board of directors for Chevron in August of 2000, when Chevron began the policy of paying these surcharges illegally under the table, and Condoleezza Rice, as a member of that board of directors, was in charge of the public policy committee to which was entrusted, yay or nay, on issues of how you would conduct international trade. I don't think we should hold President George Bush responsible. He has shown us again and again, and recklessly, that he is an irresponsible leader. I do believe we should and we must hold responsible the elected senators and representatives in the House of Representatives. They can know, they can educate, they can act. They have not in any measure adequate to the suffering that we've caused in Iraq and to the antagonism that has been broadening and growing all throughout the world to the United States. They have dropped the ball on education repeatedly, but I believe we should hold them accountable. They could pull the purse strings tight and not fund any more warfare in Iraq. They could educate this public about what it means when the president tries to bully them and say, well, you mean you don't support the people of Iraq? That's nonsense. The $145 billion spending bill, which is now before them for supplemental spending. They've already voted on the $100 billion supplemental spending bill. President Bush had a new one in the pipeline. When they come home to you during their August recess, it's just imperative that they know, that we know, that that $145 billion spending bill has in it $39 billion worth of items and equipment, Strykers, souped-up Abrams, Humvees, armored personnel carriers, ammunition, just billions worth of ammunition that won't even arrive in Iraq until the end of 2009 or 2010. So how can they dare say that they are anti-war while they're paying for the equipment and the ammunition that would keep troops in Iraq as long as 2009, 2010? And in fact, in an article entitled "Heady Days for Weapon Makers," the New York Times speculated that the Democrats will not interfere with the profit-making of the weapons makers during an election year. So it's our turn to let them know that we are paying attention. I see people holding vigils all across the country. Some of these vigiling communities have formed and persisted for 10 years, holding signs, honk if you want peace. The honks are coming so loud in some places, it's like the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Chicago. But that's not enough. I believe we should take these vigils, take these education events, and move them. It's not a terrible risk. Move them inside the offices of the elected representatives. Congress shall make no law to abridge the right of people to assemble peaceably for the redress of grievance. That's our Constitution. We have a grievance. If we want to translate the 70% of the U.S. public that has expressed their derision for this war, their denunciation of this war, into political activity, we have to set the example of taking ourselves and our communities regularly inside these offices. What to do upon arrival? Bring the files. Bring the files of the names of the people from the United States who have died and the people from Iraq who have died. Open up that file, sit down, occupy the office, and remember those names. Ahmed Mustafa, 3 years old, we remember you. Sergeant First Class Ryan Clancy, 35 years old, we remember you. Ali Majid, 12 years old, we will not forget you. Major Garrity, 27 years old, we remember you. Same school. So that's the kind of a background from which I came. But it's on my mind a bit because I'd like to begin tonight by telling you quite a lot about me finally going to Ireland. It wasn't something that ever occurred to me to do, really. But I was almost Johnny One Note, along with Bert. I think he and I might have been in the Voices in the Wilderness network from 1996 onward, two who had traveled most often back and forth to Baghdad, all in the name of breaking the economic cycle. Brother, Uncle Dick, was coming over from Ireland. I was very excited because this was something different, and we'd meet our mother's brother. And Uncle Dick walked in the door. I was a teenager, so eager to see him. He took one look at me and he said, "Oh, lass, you've got the map of Ireland written on your face." And I was upstairs crying for 2 hours, thinking all I noticed was my acne, because I'd never heard this map of Ireland on your face business. We didn't know how to do the dancing, the songs, any of it. We were just white and Catholic, and I went to the States war effort because United States warplanes were doing pit stops. They were landing in Shannon Airport on the tarmac, and many of these planes were bringing soldiers and other military over to Kuwait and to Saudi Arabia and other bases, but they were also bringing weapons and ammunition. And Ireland is a neutral country, and by constitution they were not to give any support to a belligerent country or to a country provoking warfare. So ought it not?
We have a very special guest tonight, Kathy Kelly. I'm sure many of you have seen her in person and on Democracy Now!
Well, I grew up in a part of the southwest side of Chicago that was so ghettoized, it's almost indescribable. And we were trying very, very hard always to fit in. My mother had a thick Irish brogue, and we didn't even realize that because there was so much of an effort to be like everybody else, kind of cross over one shoulder and flag over the other. And I remember so clearly when my mother's functions, we'd pack our bags with medicines and medical relief supplies and sheet music and other such things, and peel off to go to Baghdad. Well, as it seemed that warfare was more and more imminent, in January of 2003, I had been invited to go over to Ireland by the Sisters of St. Bridget in Kildare, Ireland, because Ireland was feeling particularly complicit in many quarters of the peace movement with the United States.